My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome back to another episode of Diplomatic Immunity. As always, I'm your host, Kelly McFarland from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown. And we're once again going to be talking about America at 250 today, which is our journey through different inflection points in the history of America in the world. And today, I'm excited to be joined by Amy Greenberg, who is a professor at Pennsylvania State University and an expert in all things pre-Civil War America. And so last time we talked about last time we talked about Monroe and the Monroe Doctrine and John Quincy Adams and their foreign policy. And today we're going to skip ahead a little bit to talk about the Mexican-American War and Manifest Destiny. Amy has published a book called A Wicked War, Polk, Clay, Lincoln, and the 1846 U.S. Invasion of Mexico, that came out in 2012. And I have to say, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, I've had this book on my shelf for a few years, haven't done a lot of work since grad school on pre-Civil War U.S. diplomacy, and read it last week and found it to be amazing. It's a definite page turner, and that's saying a lot for a nonfiction history book. But it is a great read, especially now that it's May 7th, we're recording this. So highly recommend picking it up for the summer season. But Amy, great book, loved it. And thanks so much for joining us today to talk about the Mexican-American War.
Thank you for having me on, Kelly. It's a real honor to be here.
So in order to understand the Mexican-American War, you've got to talk about Texas first. So can you back us up a little bit into the 1830s? I guess we could start even further than that. But what's going on in the 1830s in relation to Texas and Mexico that sort of kicks this whole thing off to get us to the point where the United States would go to war over Texas?
Right. So the short story is that after Mexico became independent, it had a really hard time settling the northern part of its country. And so the Mexican government made it easy for U.S. citizens to settle in northern Mexico. They gave them really good land options. And so, by the time you get to the middle of the 1830s, there are more people who are born in the United States living in Coahuila, Tejas, than there are Tejano people. The result being that the people who are living in what's now Texas kind of develop an identity that is not linked to Mexico at all. It's much more closely linked to the United States. And when Mexico attempts to crack down on rules preventing slavery in Mexico, the people in Texas revolt. And this ends up being the Texas Revolution, an event that, to my great sorrow, repeatedly confused with the U.S.-Mexico War. But because everybody knows about the Texas Revolution, people don't really know about the U.S.-Mexico War so much. But, in 1836, Texas becomes independent. And at that point, the majority view in Texas is that it would be nice to be annexed to the United States, but U.S. political leaders, for a variety of reasons, are not willing to annex Texas. So Texas remains an independent republic until 1845.
Yeah, and quickly before we get into that, because this comes up again, what are some of the main? You said there's a number of reasons why they're not annexing Texas. So what are sort of the main reasons?
Great question. So the main reasons are that, first of all, there's an equal number of slave and free states in the Senate. And were we to annex Texas, that would throw off the balance of power between the North and the South. Nobody really wants to do that. Well, I guess Southerners do. But.
Yeah.
So that's one issue. Andrew Jackson's president at the time that Texas becomes an independent republic, and he doesn't want to annex Texas because he's worried about exacerbating sectional tensions, but also because Mexico does not recognize Texas independence. And the main reason for that is that General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna was forced at gunpoint to sign a treaty making Texas independent, and Mexico disavows that treaty. So were the U.S. to annex Texas, it would be basically opening up a case for war on Mexico's part.
Right. And, that's why the main reasons why this was sort of discussed, but still hands off until 1844. So the president you talk about the most, although there's lots of them in there that are past presidents, future presidents, is James K. Polk. And he's not a very well-known president, one-termer. Interestingly, goes in saying he's only going to serve one term, and kind of comes out of nowhere, right? He's failed for governorship of Tennessee, and he's pulled out by Andrew Jackson to run in 1844. So where does he come from, and what are his views going into that, and how does it fit into what is happening around the election, right? There's the president, John Tyler at the time, sort of pulls the rug out from everybody, and then Polk has to come in and deal with this.
Right. So John Tyler secretly negotiates a treaty of annexation with Texas and then presents it to the Congress and throws everything out of whack. This kind of understanding that previous presidents had that Texas was off limits and we weren't going to mess with it. So Polk, of course, one thing people do know about him is that he's the first dark horse candidate. He kind of comes out of nowhere, but on the other hand, he had been Speaker of the House of Representatives during Andrew Jackson's term. So it's not like he's a complete unknown. He definitely was not a front runner in 1844. The front runners were Henry Clay for the Whigs and Martin Van Buren for the Democrats. But the problem was that the two of them both issued a statement on the same day. Looks pretty much like they colluded in doing this, saying that they thought annexing Texas was a terrible idea. And once that happened, the Democrats were really anxious to throw over Martin Van Buren because annexation and territorial expansion were hugely popular with the American people, like hugely popular. And James K. Polk is the first guy who's willing to say, you know what, I think that this country has a destiny, and the destiny is to expand, and I'm going to make that happen. So he's not afraid of annexing Texas. And he goes further than that. He talks about taking all of Oregon country from Britain when it's jointly controlled. He makes gestures towards California, which everybody knew about because of various travel writing. And a lot of businessmen saw as sort of the key to getting a handle on the Asian trade. And, Polk has a real, what you call spread eagle vision of foreign policy. And this is a brand new thing. It's a brand new thing. So, he is Mr. Manifest Destiny, and that is ultimately what propels him to election. It's certainly the thing that gets Andrew Jackson behind him.
Yeah, and you mentioned, and you talk about it in your book a little bit, the other major territorial dispute that's going on right now is the Oregon Territory with the British. And it kind of gets forgot about when people remember anything from the 1840s, they remember the Mexican-American War, not the Oregon boundary dispute. So that comes into play as well. And this all fits into this idea of manifest destiny. And we think of it today, and we've heard the term, but it was everywhere in the 1830s and 1840s. And it was really a part of the U.S. mindset from then moving forward through continental expansion. So what is manifest destiny, and how just everywhere was it in the 1840s?
Okay. So, historians disagree about this, and they've disagreed about this for a long time.
That's what we do.
There have always, as we do.
Yes.
There have always been historians who said, manifest destiny wasn't a real belief. It was political rhetoric. So it was rhetoric that the Democrats used in order to advance their position. But I have done a lot of work looking at letters and diaries of ordinary people in the 1830s and 1840s. And ordinary people, a lot of them, believed deeply that God had singled out the United States to expand across the continent or even further. I wrote another book that's called Manifest Manhood, which looks at attempts to take over land in Latin America, the Caribbean, and even South America after the Mexican-American War. And, there's kind of no limit to what some people thought the United States could be. But definitely in the 1840s, people in the United States, they looked at the incredible growth of the country since its founding. The population growth, the territorial growth, the economic growth of the nation, and they believed that there was something providential about that. So manifest destiny is the belief that God has singled out the United States for a special destiny. And that destiny involves taking land from other nations and putting it to better use than they are doing.
Right. And your last point gets me into my next question is, how does race come into this?
It's a great question. No surprise that most of the land that people are going after is under the control of people who would be considered by most people in the United States as racially inferior. So Native Americans, residents of Mexico. But, I have to point out, people really want Canada too. And Canada is not occupied, for the most part, by people who United States citizens see as racially inferior. So race has a lot to do with it, but not everything. And I also would like to point out that you got to talk about religion as well, because definitely when the people in the United States looked at Mexico, they didn't just see people that they saw as racially mixed, racially inferior, but they also saw Catholics. And there was a very strong feeling in the United States in the 1840s among Protestants, who made up most of the population, that Catholics were a menace and that they needed to be stopped. And anything that Protestants could do to limit the power of Catholicism in North America was a good thing.
Well, they didn't want people beholden to the Pope.
That's right.
For one thing, yeah. But and on the flip side too, as you talk about in your book, and we'll see, some of the things that tamped down the all of Mexico drive were this racial thing. On the flip side, right, is we don't want to incorporate all of these quote racial inferior people into the United States.
That's correct. Yeah.
So, and we'll get to that all of Mexico thing that you mentioned again, this broad vision, even broader than what we ended up getting, vision of American expansion. But so the war starts in 1846, and it's basically deliberately started by James K. Polk, and then he lies about it. So
that's correct.
Yeah.
That's correct.
So walk us through that.
Yeah. Okay. So Polk sent 4,000 soldiers under the control of Zachary Taylor. That's half of the size of the regular army, down to an area that was disputed between Texas and Mexico. This is the area between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And Mexico had a much better claim on this land than Texas did. But Polk deliberately sent the army down there. And the soldiers who went down there, the officers, they were pretty clear on what was happening, that Polk was trying to start something. They noted that when U.S. soldiers walked through the area, that the residents ran away. They definitely didn't see them as friendly soldiers. They saw them as an invading force. And then he ordered Taylor to set up camp right on the other side of the Rio Grande from where Mexican forces were. So, that's pretty direct. The other reason that we know that Polk wanted to start this war is that a couple days before he found out that war had actually started, he went to his cabinet and he suggested just declaring war on Mexico. And the cabinet said to him, well, we really can't declare war on a neighboring republic for no reason. And he came up with some reasons. He said, well, Mexico's insulted us. They owe us a bunch of money. I think we should just invade. And they said, well, no, we can't do that. And then a couple days later, he was fortunate enough to get news of what was called the Thornton Affair, where Mexicans troops did cross the river, killed 12 U.S. soldiers, and that was the reason. That was the ostensible reason for the war starting, although, Polk already had a plan about this. So then Polk goes to Congress, and instead of asking Congress to declare war, he tells them that there's a war that's in process and asks them for money to support the troops. So this is kind of the first time this happens in American history.
It puts them in a tough spot.
Absolutely. And all but 14 members of Congress, all but 14 representatives vote in favor of this war, even though everybody knows that Polk's claim that American blood has been shed on American soil, and despite the U.S. best effort to prevent war it started, everybody knows that that's just not true. They still vote in favor of the war. And it's only a few representatives who are from anti-slavery, very safe districts in New England or the upper Midwest who are willing to say, no, this is just not true, and we're not going to support the war.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams is one of them. So the war, they fight a major battle at Buena Vista. The country tends to rally around the war effort. But then news of the deaths start to come back. And the war keeps going on, and Taylor ends up, or Winfield Scott, ends up occupying Mexico City.
Correct.
But it's kind of lingering with no end. And then we start to see this creeping anti-war movement at the same time that his cabinet is getting more gung-ho of getting all of Mexico. So how does this anti-war movement start playing out in the midst of that? Then we'll get into the whole Nicholas Trist, actual diplomacy side of things.
So there's a lot of things that are really interesting about the U.S.-Mexico War. Like if you're interested in military history, you've got the first amphibious landing. In U.S. history, you've got like new weapons.
A training ground for the Civil War.
All these officers, including Grant, get their first kind of stab at battle there. But one thing that's really fascinating about it to me is that this is the U.S.'s first experience of occupying a foreign capital. Because in between September of 1847 and February of 1848, the U.S. Army is just in residence in Mexico City. They captured Mexico City, but there's no way to end the war because Mexico refuses to do so. So it's just a fascinating moment when the U.S. learns what it means to occupy a foreign capital, and nobody knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, and we are by no means a good occupier.
No, they learn that they're not a good occupier, and then Mexicans are not really happy about them being there either. So overall, it doesn't go great. But what happens during this period is that the most spread eagle expansionists in the United States say, this is our opportunity. We have captured Mexico City. That means Mexico is ours. And since we believe that the U.S. will do a better job governing and making use of foreign resources, let's take all of Mexico. All of Mexico should be absorbed into the United States. So on one hand, this is very appealing to many people, makes sense to a lot of people. But on the other hand, it raises the question of what are we going to do with the 3 million Mexicans who live in the valley of Mexico, around Mexico City? How are we going to absorb these people into a population of 30 million American people? Up until this time, all annexations had involved giving rights, somewhat begrudgingly, to the residents of the place that you are absorbing, whether that was Louisiana or anywhere else. But what do you do in this case? And it's at this point that the strongest opponents of absorbing all of Mexico say, you know what? We don't want to absorb people that we see as racially inferior into the polity. Nobody's talking about enslaving them. You obviously are not going to enslave Mexican people who are of somewhat questionable to many people, but of mixed race. You're not going to enslave them.
Mhm.
So what are you going to do? Can we give them political rights? And so it's really racism that kind of puts the hold on all of Mexico. But at the same time that people are debating this, the key thing is that Polk and his cabinet start really thinking about, well, how much of Mexico can we take? We have Mexico City. What if we take all of what's now the state of Sonora? What if we take all of Tamaulipas? What if we take Baja California? So there's visions of how much of Mexico that can be absorbed in the United States that are actually much broader than what ends up being
Mhm.
part of the U.S.
Yeah. And you also, at the same time as that discussion's going on, you have this rising anti-war sentiment because of the deaths, some of them very high profile, that and these ideas of, we can't take all of Mexico. What are we doing there still? And this uh, sentiment of, it's time to move on. And you get people starting to speak out, like Henry Clay, who has one of his most famous speeches late in his career, and Abraham Lincoln, who, when this debate is beginning, is starting his one term in Congress. And as you know in the book, he wants to go there and talk about tariffs and improving roads and, the Whig economic outlook. But he ends up really kind of changing tack because of this. So talk a little bit about where that turnabout comes from and how that manifests itself throughout 1848.
Okay, so the crucial thing to know here before you get into the anti-war movement is nobody thought this war would last very long.
Mm-hmm.
James Polk's brother, William, writes to him. He's posted in Europe doing some diplomatic function. He writes to him at the beginning of the war and he says, hey, I want to come back. Will you give me, I want to be an officer. And Polk says, don't bother. It'll be over by the time you make it back from Europe.
Yeah.
So Polk really thinks this is going to last really actually thinks it's going to be like one battle. And then Mexicans will turn and they'll flee and it'll all be over. But nobody thinks it's going to go on longer than a year. In fact, when Polk calls up volunteers, he only calls them up for 12 months because he thinks there's no way that it lasts more than 12 months. So after 12 months, the war still isn't over. People are bored. They're tired of it.
Mm-hmm.
People are tired of this war.
The next round of volunteers obviously aren't going to be as gung-ho as the first round of volunteers. So it's harder, everything's more difficult.
Right. Initially, volunteer enthusiasm, like you pointed out, it's incredible. But they can't find anybody to come in and replace these 12-month volunteers after they're done. Nobody wants to do it. People are over it. They're done. They're done with it. They're bored of the war. So, there's a tiredness of the war. There is a lot of death that's mainly due to disease. It's just ugly. It's ugly. And you have a whole bunch of politicians who are elected in 1846, 1847, who are opposed to the war. And Abraham Lincoln, yeah, you're right. He's a Whig. His whole thing is economic development. That is what has motivated him throughout his career. But when he goes to Washington, D.C., the first speech that he makes is about the U.S.-Mexico War. And he points out in wonderful lawyerly language that when Polk said that American blood had been shed on American soil, he was lying. And it's called his spot resolutions. And he basically says, show me the spot where this blood was shed, and I'll show you that that was never part of the United States. So Lincoln is like one of many voices who call the war unjust, who want to see the U.S. pull out, and who definitely don't want to see it continue.
Mm-hmm. So before we get to the diplomacy that ends the war, I want to talk quickly about John Hardin, because he's a fascinating figure that I'm sure 99.9% of our listeners have never heard of. And the story's so fascinating because if John Hardin doesn't die, it's one of the what ifs of history, right? If John Hardin doesn't die in Mexico at the Battle of Buena Vista, do we end up having Abraham Lincoln the way we end up getting Abraham Lincoln? So who is John Hardin, and what am I talking about?
Okay. So yes, this is a very good reason to read the book.
Yes.
Because you'll meet John Hardin, and you'll also meet his daughter, who's pretty cool too.
Founded the Daughters of American Revolution.
Yeah, his daughter ends up founding the Daughters of American Revolution. But so John Hardin is the leading Whig in Illinois at the time that Abraham Lincoln is coming up. And he is a lot of things that Lincoln isn't. He's very well born. He's wealthy. He's extremely handsome. He's got a lot of charisma. Not that Lincoln doesn't have charisma, but it's Hardin is the leading Whig. And Hardin volunteers to lead the Volunteers of Illinois. And he goes down to Illinois with them after serving a term in Congress, and he gets killed in Buena Vista. And that really opens up the door for Abraham Lincoln to flourish and to flower as kind of a leading Whig politician in Illinois. Previous to that, he had definitely been underneath Hardin's shadow.
Yeah, you mentioned there's supposedly a gentleman's agreement between these three Springfieldite area Whigs, Hardin, I think it was Baker. And Lincoln, to each serve a term and like let the other one kind of go. And Hardin kind of backtracks on that after serving in Congress and wants to go back, but then ends up stepping aside for Lincoln. And he writes to his wife in Buena Vista that, you know, what does all this politics matter? I'm in life and death situations here. And it's, you know, sounds like he's not going to get into politics again. But as you note in the book, who knows once he got back and like life got back to normal and he wanted that again. So I found it to be just a fascinating story of these what ifs and contingencies in history that was just fascinating to read and think about.
Yeah, and had he come back, he would have been a war hero. Which, as we know, you get a lot. It helps.
Yes, it does. As the successor to Polk knows well, Zachary Taylor. But moving on to the actual negotiations. So Nicholas Trist is another fascinating vignette in the book. Here's a guy that is sort of a pupil of Thomas Jefferson, and comes up, is working at the second in command at the State Department. And it's also fascinating to look back at like what the State Department was in 1846, right? It's like 6 dudes, you know, it's crazy. But you know, so he's sent to Mexico. Polk thinks he can trust him and that he's on the same page, totally misreads him.
That's right.
He goes to Mexico, has his conscience gets to him. He ends up having, and I'll let you tell this in more detail, but him and Winfield Scott are like hate each other and are writing these letters back home about each other that are just scathing, but then they end up becoming like BFFs. It's just a fascinating story. And then Trist is recalled, but doesn't go home because he's like, my conscience is telling me I have to do what's right here, not just for the United States, but for Mexico.
That's right. So
what is the story here?
Well,
it's fascinating.
I believe Trist is the first diplomat who gets recalled and then refuses to come back. But Polk straight up tells him, you need to come back. And Trist writes him a really long letter and says, no, I'm not coming back. And the reason Polk recalls Trist is that when Polk sent Trist to Mexico to negotiate a treaty of peace, he had a pretty limited idea of what he wanted that treaty to look like. But again, once the U.S. occupies Mexico City, once the All Mexico movement starts heating up, Polk's idea of how much land he wants from Mexico really expands. So he wants Trist to come back. He wants to send a different diplomat over there. And Trist hilariously just says, no, I'm not going to go back. So Trist, as you point out, Trist and Scott, who I think of as both very prickly guys, especially Scott, they get off on the wrong foot. They do hate each other. Eventually they become friends basically over like some marmalade that Scott gives Trist. It's kind of confusing, but the two guys realize they have a lot in common and they actually enjoy each other's company. And one thing that they both agree on is that the U.S. should not be in Mexico City. And again, race plays a big part in this. It's not so much that Trist loves the people of Mexico and feels like the U.S. shouldn't be infringing on them, although, you know, he does to some extent feel like they've had a bad deal in this whole thing. But he also feels like, along with Scott, that there really isn't, that the people in Mexico hate the people of the United States so much that it is a very bad idea to try and absorb them into the United States. Uh, he sees them as too different in terms of religion, in terms of culture. But more to the point, both of them, because they are on the ground in Mexico City, can see how much most Mexican people hate and resent the United States, which is understandable to us. But to some people back in the United States, they're not aware of that, right? They think Mexicans should be welcoming people from the United States with open arms because we can bring them all these wonderful things that they don't have.
Yeah.
Trist goes into negotiations with Mexico from a really wonderful position of power. And that position is that everybody in Mexico in the diplomatic corps knows that he has been recalled. So they know that if they don't make an agreement with Trist, whoever comes after him is going to give them a worse deal. And this is the thing that the United States needs in order to convince the Mexican government to come to terms. Because one of the things about occupying a foreign country's capital, when the other country refuses to sign a peace treaty with you, is that you can't effectively end the war. And this is one thing I really like talking to my students about, because students, at least at Penn State, they tend to think like whoever is the more powerful party, they hold all the cards. And this is probably because Penn State's good at football, or probably has something to do with football, right? Like you beat the other team, you win. But that's not how it works in diplomatic relations, right? Both parties have to come to terms. Both have to agree on something or the issue isn't settled. And so Trist basically forces Mexico to settle by saying, I'm going to give you the best deal you can get. And they believe that because they know he's been recalled.
Yeah. And what do we end up getting?
Yeah. So we end up
And he actually does it on the cheap.
He totally does it on the cheap. I mean, it's a profound disappointment to James K. Polk and to expansionists in the United States. But Trist goes in looking for a good deal for Mexico. And what he sees as a good deal for Mexico is the absolute minimum that he feels like he can take and give back to the absolute minimum that Trist sees the United States accepting. So, for instance, Baja California. Nope. We do not, as you're probably aware, currently control Baja California. We do not currently control access of Tehuantepec. We do not currently own Sonora. So these are all the things that Polk wanted, and Trist did not force Mexico to give up.
Right, but we get California he was authorized to 20 million, right? And he gets it for 15.
Wait, that's right.
And wasn't it signed like just before they found gold too?
Sadly for Mexico, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed and sealed 3 months before gold was discovered at Sutter's Fort.
Yeah.
But yeah, so of course, right. If you look at the map of the United States now, the entire Southwest comes as a result of Trist negotiation, with the exception of, a small part of Arizona, which is the Gadsden Purchase. But basically what it looks like now, that's Trist doing. But the key thing here is that is much less of Mexico than Polk wanted, and much less of Mexico than Polk felt like he could fight for, except for the fact that Congress was now in the hands of opponents of the war.
Right.
So when the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gets back to Polk, he is furious. He's furious that Trist went behind his back and negotiated a treaty that he sees as way too weak, not remotely what he wants. But he says in his diary that he cannot reject this treaty because he's convinced that Congress will not authorize any more funding or forces to continue fighting the war. And if he rejects this treaty, he's afraid he's going to lose California altogether.
Right. Because at the end of the day, it's still a massive amount of territory.
It's half of all of Mexico's territory.
Yeah, it's insane. So, all right, last question. And I don't need to tell you this. There's obviously legacies that come out of this. And, U.S.-Mexican relations are more in the news now than they have been in years. So what is the legacy of this war and this territorial aggrandizement by the U.S. and not just for the U.S., but, even more importantly for Mexico moving forward, and how it plays into how Latin American countries view the United States.
Well, I think this is the first moment that no matter how optimistic you are in Latin America, you can't actually say that the United States wishes you well. Certainly, everybody in Mexico knows that the U.S. is rapacious and that they're not safe.
Yeah, and we see that again, then this in Latin America is a sort of a reoccurring theme over the next decades. And Wilson almost goes to war with Mexico, occupations in the Caribbean and Latin America, Cold War activities, all these different things throughout the years. How is it remembered in the U.S.? Especially, you talk about it a little bit, especially leading up to the Civil War and in that era.
Okay. Before the Civil War, okay, let me back up here and say, there is one war that doesn't have a monument in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Kelly, you want to guess what it is?
Mexican-American War.
That's correct. There's no monument. And why is there no monument to the U.S.-Mexico War? I mean, I think that the reason is that this is not a war that the U.S. is particularly proud of. It's not even proud of it right after it ends. And the reason people in the U.S. are not proud of this war is because it's a war just fought to take territory. There's no principle behind this war.
Mhm.
And ultimately, the United States wants to think that it gets involved in wars to do good things. I
Right.
mean, that there are principles behind the wars that we fight. And nobody really can claim that with the U.S.-Mexico War. So it's a war that people would really rather forget, and they do forget.
Mhm.
I grew up in Southern California, and my textbook, kind of elementary school textbook, had the missions. And then there was a Bear Flag Revolt, which was some
Mhm.
guys, raising up a flag. And then suddenly it was the United States.
Right.
Like we skipped the whole Mexican period of California history. And we definitely skipped the U.S.-Mexico War. It was subsumed into this Bear Flag Revolt thing. So, and that's in an area that came directly out of the Mexican Cession. So it's not remembered in the United States. And the real process of forgetting happens after the Civil War,
Mhm.
because the Republican Party is basically made up of people who were Whigs.
Mhm.
I mean, that's an incredible simplification.
Right.
But a lot of the people who become powerful figures after the Civil War are people who oppose the war. And I would include in that group Ulysses S. Grant,
Mhm.
who gives the title to the book, A Wicked War, because Grant said, he didn't know that there was ever a more wicked war than the one fought by the United States against Mexico, specifically because we were a more powerful nation. And we just went in and took what we wanted.
Yeah. Well, Amy, fascinating. This has been wonderful to talk. And I could obviously talk to you for like an hour and a half and more about legacy and other things. But highly recommend folks go out and pick this up for your beach read in the summer. It's like a novel. But Amy, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kelly.